Having examined both Reagan and Bush speeches following a major NASA disaster, I now want to turn to the instructive ways in which they're similar and different. And remember, we're doing this to see how individual language choices can add up to sort of a general different feel in a speech. So in terms of structural similarities, they're pretty doggone similar, right? You've got an opening, they go through the names of the lost, recognition of the nobility and their sacrifice, and then they both have some issues in there about we won't stop here, we'll continue on with space exploration. And I'll come back to this a couple of times, but without a doubt, Bush had the more challenging issue here because the Reagan speech had been established for 17 years and people had acknowledged it as a really good speech. So Bush has to develop a speech that is similar but can't be too different, but is not exactly doing the exact same thing that the Reagan speech was doing. So it is a different set of speech constraints, I think, that Bush is operating under than what Reagan had. Slightly. I mean, they're both dealing with major shuttle explosions. But also in terms of structural differences. Reagan's is almost twice as long. So it has almost twice as many words. So Reagan's comes in at 652 and Bush's is at 375. And Reagan's is about a minute longer. So Reagan goes 4 minutes 15 seconds and Bush goes, I think, is like 3 minutes and 12 seconds. So structurally, Reagan includes at least 2 historical references that Bush doesn't have. And these become important because, as we'll see, they link Reagan's speech to the common theme of American pioneers. So both discuss, stylistically, both discuss the astronauts in terms of sacrifice in service of knowledge. But again, Reagan ties the astronauts and the NASA program more explicitly to a pioneer ethos, an American pioneer ethos. And so in that sense, Reagan's is about the astronauts, but it's also about the NASA program, and it's about the NASA's program's difference from the Soviet space program. So that section in there where he's talking about we do ours out in the open, it's very much a Cold War action there that's happening. So in some ways, Reagan's is about more stuff. It's about the astronauts, but it's about the astronauts and these other much larger things. So the theme of sacrifice really sort of ties these aspects together. Now, contrast that to Bush's, which is really much more about the astronauts. Certainly at this point, there's no need to talk about there's no Soviet, so there's no need to talk about the contrast between the American and Soviet programs. But Bush's is more just about the astronauts and their sacrifice and their loss of life. And I know some people who prefer Bush's speech simply for that reason. They feel it's more respectful of the fallen. Now, in terms of other stylistic elements that they're pulling in, Reagan uses this modern poem. It's from World War II, this High Flight, which is the name of the poem. That's what he ends on when he says, slip the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. So that's that has clearly religious connotations, but it's not religious scripture. But it has, and I think it's important that it comes at the end, it has a sort of sublime action, right? The speech is ending and taking off at the same time. And so it just ends on sort of this uplifting note. And Bush uses something else, uses religious sounding stuff, but it's clearly Old Testament. So he's pulling from Isaiah. And it stands out as sounding very Old Testament. And so you've got this choice of sort of religious sounding talk, but one is more colloquial and one is sort of very Old Testament sounding in spoken English anyway. And so in that sense, Reagan's is actually, I would say, probably more plain spoken overall, and that kind of matches up with generally how we would classify Reagan's discourse. But it's more plain spoken in the sense that it's using simpler and common words, but I don't think that actually makes it sound any less elegant. But there's a lot of deliberate framing going on in that speech. So when Reagan's talking about the astronauts, we're talking about heroes, courage, brave, special grace, special spirit, wish to serve, hunger. They were pioneers. And he even makes a reference to say that we, audience members, Americans watching the speech, are pioneers. So we're really brought together with those astronauts under a common definition. And then when talking about the NASA program, again, we've got this pioneer metaphor, but talking about process of exploration and discovery, expanding man's horizon, pulling us into the future, quest, right? All of these activate one another. They have resonance with one another. pioneer, exploration, sacrifice for the greater good, so on and so forth. All of these have connections. These terms have connections. And so ultimately, Reagan really builds this pioneer metaphor deeply into the speech. And so it affects his discussions of the astronauts, of the program, of the Americans' mission in space at the time. And so it acknowledges the loss. That's sometimes what happens. But it also, the metaphor provides a justification. Bush has some of that, but not nearly to the same degree. So in that sense, I would say probably Reagan's is mournful, but there's a lot of hope in that speech. And Bush's tends to be more mournful. So both of these are historical speeches that allow us to see how two remarkably similar speeches can end up sounding and feeling very different. But once again, our goal here is to see how these individual wording choices, add up to something bigger, a framing of the speech. Clearly, Reagan's framing is pioneer. That is the theme. So what I would like you to do is cough, because that's part of the process of creation. But what I would like you to do is think about developing your value language, that core metaphor, that core idea. One way to do so is just think in terms of, in the end, my topic is all about value. It's about dying and coughing. I hope your speeches aren't on that, but thinking about, here's my topic, and in the end, the root value is X. Whatever that X is, you're trying to find terms and ideas and language that amplify that core value. So you can think of this in terms of sort of nouns and verbs. What are your cluster of nouns that amplify that value? Last time I talked about speaking on mandatory vaccine against human papillomavirus. So if we're thinking of nouns that amplify that, the core idea, I would want to say, oh, this is about public health, it's about social safety, it's about cultivating a cancer-free society. HPV in girls can lead to cervical cancer. And then you also want to think about verbs. What does your proposal do? Well, HPV, HPV saves, it protects, it nurtures. How ironic that those would be the terms that I'm talking about now as I'm dying. Clearly, literally in front of you, in front of your screen. That's not literally, there's nothing literal about that. So what does your proposal do? Well, I'd say in terms of my verbs, it saves, it protects, it nurtures, it's an investment in the future, it invests in these children. Maybe think in terms of verbs of what describes if we don't act according to your recommendation. Well, we risk, we threaten, we endanger people with the chances of cervical cancer, or just the dangers and problems associated with human papillomavirus. So you want to think through what's your core value, and then what's the language that comes off of that value? What are the nouns that amplify that? What are the verbs that amplify that? Reagan had that with that pioneer metaphor in thinking in terms of nouns and verbs and coming up with the language that frames the understanding of the topic. So this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of stylistic framing, how you're strategically organizing our thoughts, or our approach, or our understanding of your topic. In the next lecture, we'll start in on the really fun stuff of stylistic language use.